On a limestone ridge overlooking the rolling farmland of central Pennsylvania, there stands a mansion that was built to celebrate the American dream. High Point, as it was called, rose above the chocolate factory town of Hershey like a crown upon a hill, a symbol of one man's triumph over poverty and failure. From its windows, Milton Hershey could survey everything he had created: the factories, the schools, the parks, the neat rows of workers' homes stretching toward the horizon. But on the morning of April 7, 1937, if Milton Hershey had looked down from those windows, he would have witnessed something that shattered the illusion of his perfect town. 3,000 men, armed with baseball bats, clubs, and ice picks, were storming his chocolate factory. They were not invaders from outside. They were his own people, loyal workers and dairy farmers who had decided to take matters into their own hands. Inside the factory, hundreds of striking workers realized too late that their peaceful sit-down protest was about to turn violent. The mob outnumbered them 4-1. Within minutes, the violence would be over, but the mythology of Hershey, Pennsylvania, the utopian company town, the workers' paradise, the chocolate-scented Eden, would never be the same. This is the story of High Point Mansion, the house that chocolate built. But it is also about what happens when a benevolent dictator builds a perfect world and discovers that perfection cannot be maintained by good intentions alone. This is about paternalism and resentment, of prosperity and exploitation, of a visionary who gave his workers everything except the one thing they ultimately demanded: their freedom. To understand how paradise turned to violence, we must first understand the man who built it all and the empire that rose from failure and determination. If you enjoy uncovering the darker histories hidden behind grand estates, you're welcome to subscribe and explore more with me. Milton Snavely Hershey was born in 1857 to Swiss and German immigrant parents in rural Pennsylvania. His childhood was marked by instability. His father, Henry, chased failed business ventures, while his stern Mennonite mother, Fanny, held the family together through faith and hard work. Milton attended perhaps 7 different schools, never progressing beyond a 4th grade education. At 14, he was apprenticed to Joseph Royer, a confectioner in Lancaster, where he discovered a passion for candy making that formal schooling had never awakened. For 4 years, he learned the art of confectionery, mastering not just techniques, but innovation. What followed were 15 years of spectacular failures. Milton opened candy businesses in Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, and New Orleans. Each one collapsed, leaving him deeper in debt. By 1886, he was 30 years old, with nothing but broken dreams. But he tried once more in Lancaster, borrowing $700 to start the Lancaster Caramel Company. Using fresh milk from local dairy farms, he created a superior product. This time, fortune smiled. Within years, he was operating multiple factories and had become wealthy. In 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Milton saw German chocolate-making machinery and became obsessed with a new vision. He saw the possibility of mass production, making chocolate affordable for ordinary Americans. In 1900, Milton sold the Lancaster Caramel Company for $1 million, roughly $35 million today. At 43, he could have retired wealthy. Instead, he bet everything on chocolate and decided to build something unprecedented, not just a factory, but an entire town designed for his workers. He would call it Hershey. In 1903, Milton Hershey purchased farmland 30 miles northwest of Lancaster, near his birthplace in Derry Township. The land was remote, rolling hills and dairy farms far from major cities. But Milton saw advantages: dairy farms that could supply fresh milk, Spring Creek providing water, and beautiful countryside where workers could live healthy lives far from industrial cities. Construction began immediately. The chocolate factory rose first, but Milton's vision extended far beyond its walls. He would build an entire town from nothing, and it would be like no company town America had ever seen. By 1905, the factory was operational and the town was taking shape. The streets were paved and electrically lit. Every worker's home had electricity, indoor plumbing, and central heating, amenities still rare in cities and almost unheard of in rural areas. Houses were solidly built and arranged along tree-lined streets with whimsical names: Chocolate Avenue and Cocoa Avenue, Trinidad and Araba, Para and Java. Each street name, a reminder that this town existed because of a bean that grew thousands of miles away. A public trolley system connected Hershey to nearby towns. There was a bank, a department store, a free consolidated school, churches, a YMCA, and, a library. On May 30th, 1906, Milton opened Hershey Park along Spring Creek, initially a picnic ground that grew into an elaborate attraction. In 1910, he added the Hershey Zoo with exotic animals from around the world. Everything was designed with workers' welfare in mind. There were baseball fields and tennis courts, swimming pools and golf courses. The air smelled perpetually of chocolate, a sweet aroma that drifted from the factory and settled over the town like a blessing. In 1909, Milton and his wife Catherine, who had no children of their own, established the Hershey Industrial School for orphaned boys, wanting to give children the opportunities Milton himself had nearly been denied. Journalists and reformers came from around the world to study this Pennsylvania miracle. Here was proof that capitalism didn't have to be cruel, that industrialists could prosper while providing workers with dignity and quality of life. And in 1908, with his town flourishing, Milton built himself a mansion worthy of his success. Milton chose the highest point in the area for his home, a limestone ridge that commanded sweeping views of the factory below and the surrounding countryside. The location was symbolic. From this elevated position, Milton could literally oversee everything he had created, watching his workers arrive at the factory each morning, seeing the trolleys move through the streets, observing the children playing in the parks he had built for them. High Point Mansion was completed in 1908, and it reflected Milton's character perfectly. The house was substantial but not ostentatious, a reflection of his Mennonite upbringing and his belief that excess was sinful. While other industrialists of the era were building palaces with marble ballrooms, gold-leafed ceilings, and dozens of servants, Milton's mansion was relatively modest by Gilded Age standards. The architecture was elegant and refined, featuring clean lines and classic proportions. The exterior presented a dignified face to the world, solid, permanent, prosperous, without being pretentious. It was built of brick and stone, materials that would endure for generations, just as Milton hoped his town would endure. Inside, High Point revealed the hand of a man who valued quality craftsmanship and comfort over showiness. The reception rooms featured fine woodwork, carved mantels, wainscoting, and built-in cabinetry that demonstrated the skill of local craftsmen. The floors were polished hardwood, rich and warm. Large windows in every major room flooded the interior with natural light and provided those commanding views of the town below. The mansion had all the modern conveniences that Milton had insisted upon for his workers' homes, and then some. Electric lighting throughout, when many rural estates still relied on gas lamps or candles. Indoor plumbing with hot and running water, central heating that kept the house comfortable even during harsh Pennsylvania winters, a telephone, connected Milton to his factory and offices. But the house wasn't cold or institutional despite its modernity. Catherine Hershey, called Kitty by those who knew her, made High Point a warm and welcoming home. She decorated the rooms with comfortable furniture, hung paintings on the walls, filled vases with fresh flowers from the gardens. The couple entertained modestly, hosting dinners for business associates and community leaders, but nothing approaching the lavish parties that characterized other industrialists' estates. The grounds surrounding High Point were landscaped with the same attention to detail that Milton brought to everything. Gardens were planted with native trees and flowering shrubs. Pathways wound through the property, offering quiet places to walk and think. From these gardens, the views were even more spectacular. The chocolate factory in the middle distance, its smokestacks rising against the sky, and beyond it, the grid of streets and houses that formed the town. Milton and Catherine had no children, and this sorrow permeated High Point. The rooms that might have echoed with the laughter of sons and daughters remained quiet. This childlessness was one of the driving forces behind their decision to establish the Hershey Industrial School. If they could not have children of their own, they would become parents to hundreds of boys who desperately needed the opportunities that Milton had nearly been denied. From High Point's windows, particularly from the upper floors, Milton could watch his town wake up each morning. He could see the workers walking or taking the trolley to the factory. He could observe children heading to school. He could watch the town's daily rhythms unfold beneath him, like a living organism that he had brought into being through sheer force of will and vision. The mansion stood as physical proof of what could be achieved through determination and innovation. Milton had been born in poverty, had failed repeatedly, had been dismissed as a dreamer who would never amount to anything. Now, he lived in a mansion on a hill, overseeing an empire built on chocolate, surrounded by a town that bore his name and reflected his values. But High Point was more than just a home. It was a command center, a place from which Milton could oversee his expanding empire. He often worked from home, receiving reports from factory managers and town administrators, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. The mansion became a symbol not just of his personal success, but of his ongoing control over every aspect of the community he had created. In March 1915, tragedy struck High Point. Catherine Hershey died after a long illness. She was just 52 years old. Milton was devastated. He had lost his partner, his companion, the woman who had shared his vision and helped him create something meaningful from their wealth. Catherine's death changed Milton profoundly. High Point became a lonelier place, haunted by memories of happier times. Milton threw himself into work and philanthropy with renewed intensity, as if he could outrun his grief through constant activity. In November 1918, still mourning Catherine, Milton made an extraordinary decision. He placed almost his entire fortune, including control of the Hershey Chocolate Corporation, into a perpetual trust for the benefit of the Hershey Industrial School. The trust was worth roughly $60 million at the time, equivalent to nearly $1 billion today. When asked why he had given away such an enormous fortune, Milton's answer was characteristically straightforward. "I never could see what happiness a rich man gets from contemplating a life of acquisition only, with the cold and legal distribution of his money after he is gone." High Point remained Milton's home through the prosperous 1920s, as his chocolate empire continued to grow and his town became internationally famous. The mansion stood witness to Milton's greatest triumphs and his deepest sorrows, a silent observer of history unfolding in the valley below. And in 1937, from those same windows where Milton had watched his town prosper and grow for nearly 3 decades, he would witness the collapse of his utopian dream. When the Great Depression began in 1929, company towns across America crumbled, but Hershey, Pennsylvania seemed immune. Americans still bought chocolate, and the Hershey Chocolate Corporation made more than $37 million in after-tax profits between 1930 and 1936. Milton Hershey, now in his 70s, launched his Great Building campaign. Rather than lay off workers, he would spend millions employing them to build monuments that would define Hershey for generations. In 1930, the Hershey Country Club opened with beautifully landscaped golf courses. But Milton's greatest ambition was the Hotel Hershey, begun in 1931. He chose another hilltop location where the building would command sweeping views of the valley below. The Hotel Hershey was designed in Spanish colonial revival style, inspired by hotels Milton had seen in Cuba. The building rose like a Mediterranean palace, cream-colored stucco walls, red tile roofs, arched windows and doorways. A fountain courtyard featured intricate tile work and flowering gardens. Inside, the hotel was spectacular. The lobby featured marble floors and columns, ornate plasterwork, crystal chandeliers. The guest rooms had fine furniture and modern amenities. The Hotel Hershey opened in May 1933, employing hundreds and drawing visitors from across the nation. That September, the Hershey Theater opened, an Art Deco masterpiece with a marble lobby, grand staircase, and murals depicting theatrical history. The auditorium seated nearly 2,000, its ceiling painted with gold leaf. Milton brought in Broadway shows and famous orchestras, giving his workers access to culture that rivaled Philadelphia or New York. In 1936, Hershey Park Arena was completed for hockey, basketball, and conventions. In 1939, Hershey Park Stadium opened for concerts and sporting events with seating for more than 16,000. From 1930 to 1936, Milton spent more than $10 million on construction, roughly $200 million today. He employed hundreds when jobs were impossible to find. Hershey became famous across America as a beacon of hope during the Depression. From High Point Mansion, Milton could watch these monuments rising on the hilltops around his town. It must have seemed like the culmination of everything he had dreamed of. A perfect town thriving during America's darkest economic hour. But there were shadows beneath the sweetness, tensions that would explode into violence by 1937. Hershey, Pennsylvania looked like paradise. The streets were clean, the houses well maintained, the parks beautifully landscaped. The air smelled perpetually of chocolate, a rich, sweet aroma that greeted residents every morning and lulled them to sleep at night. Workers earned wages that were higher than they could have found elsewhere, and they enjoyed benefits that were revolutionary for the era. Pension plans, access to medical care, recreational facilities that most Americans could only dream of. From the windows of High Point, Milton Hershey could survey his creation with satisfaction. He had built something unprecedented, a town where capitalism and compassion coexisted, where workers prospered alongside their employer, where the American dream seemed not just possible, but guaranteed. But paradise had a price, and that price was control. Milton Hershey wasn't just an employer. He was the architect and owner of an entire world. He decided where the streets would be built and what they would be named. He determined which businesses could operate in town and which could not. He established the social calendar, the cultural offerings, the recreational opportunities. He created schools and determined their curricula. He built churches and influenced their congregations. He controlled the utilities, the transportation system, the retail stores. Everything in Hershey, Pennsylvania existed because Milton Hershey willed it into existence. And while this had created unprecedented prosperity and stability, it had also created an atmosphere of paternalism that some workers found increasingly suffocating. There was no municipal government in Hershey. Instead, the Hershey Improvement Company, later renamed Hershey Estates, served that function, providing electricity, telephone service, water, sewage systems, and all the infrastructure typically managed by elected officials. From 1927 onward, Hershey Estates oversaw 33 separate companies covering everything from birth to death. The Hershey Hospital to the Hershey Cemetery, the Hershey Park to the Hershey Zoo. The company monitored workers' private lives in ways that would seem unthinkable today. Management knew who drank too much, who kept an untidy home, who failed to maintain proper moral standards. This information appeared in personnel files and influenced career advancement. Hiring and firing decisions were often made based on personal relationships and favoritism rather than merit. Workers who attended church regularly and participated enthusiastically in company-sponsored activities found themselves promoted. Those who kept to themselves or questioned management decisions found their hours cut or their employment terminated. The company influenced which workers could purchase homes and which couldn't, which families received certain privileges and which didn't. For many workers, especially those who had known poverty and unemployment during the Depression, these concerns seemed like ingratitude. Milton Hershey had given them everything: good wages, nice homes, a beautiful town. How dare anyone complain about minor intrusions into their private lives? But for others, particularly younger workers and those influenced by the growing labor movement sweeping across America in the 1930s, the paternalism felt like a gilded cage. They had jobs and security, yes, but they had no voice, no agency, no ability to collectively negotiate for their own interests. And then, despite the apparent prosperity, working conditions began to deteriorate in ways that contradicted the public image of Hershey Paradise. The factory work was brutal. Temperatures inside often exceeded 100 degrees, especially in the summer months. The noise levels were so high that workers suffered hearing damage. The pace of production was relentless, with orders to speed up constantly pressuring workers to move faster, work harder, take fewer breaks. Men came home exhausted, their bodies aching from repetitive motions and physically demanding labor. Before the Depression, Hershey employees had been accustomed to 60-hour work weeks. When hours were cut to 40 per week, initially required by the National Recovery Administration, paychecks shrank dramatically. Many families had difficulty getting by on their reduced wages. And when Milton eliminated annual bonuses that workers had come to depend on, the financial strain increased. The workers saw that the Hershey Chocolate Corporation was making enormous profits, more than $37 million in after-tax profits between 1930 and 1936. They saw Milton spending $10 million on building monuments, hotels, and theaters and stadiums. But they were taking home less money than they had before the Depression. From the workers' perspective, the math didn't add up. The company was thriving. The owner was building palaces. But their paychecks had shrunk and their working conditions had deteriorated. In the last weeks of 1936, a newsletter began circulating in the Hershey factory. It was called the Chocolate Bar Bee, and its tone was inflammatory. The newsletter detailed workers' grievances, low wages compared to the company's massive profits, erratic work schedules that made it impossible to plan family life, dangerous speed-up orders that led to injuries, the exhausting physical labor in extreme heat and deafening noise. The newsletter scolded the big bosses, company president William Murray and Milton Hershey himself, for their high salaries and slave-driving methods. It strongly advised workers to organize and unionize, and it was signed by the Communist Party of Hershey, Pennsylvania. The communist signature was likely more strategic than ideological, but for many in Hershey, it confirmed their worst fears. Outside agitators, communists, were trying to destroy their perfect town. In January 1937, organizers from the Congress of Industrial Organizations held a secret meeting at a firehouse in nearby Palmyra. The timing was not coincidental. Just weeks earlier, workers at General Motors plants in Flint, Michigan, had conducted a dramatic sit-down strike that lasted 44 days. Despite fierce opposition from the company and local authorities, the strikers had prevailed, forcing GM to recognize the United Auto Workers Union and agree to improved wages and working conditions. The Flint sit-down captured the imagination of workers across America. Sit-down strikes, where workers occupied their factories rather than simply picketing outside, had proven remarkably effective. By controlling the means of production, workers could shut down operations completely. Management couldn't bring in strikebreakers because the workers physically controlled the factory floor. Several hundred Hershey employees attended that January meeting in Palmyra. They formed a local chapter of the United Chocolate Workers Union affiliated with the CIO. Within weeks, membership swelled to several hundred. When the union first approached management in March, the response seemed conciliatory. The company agreed to raise minimum wages to 60 cents per hour for men and 45 cents for women, a meaningful increase that suggested conflict could be avoided. For a brief moment, it seemed like Milton Hershey's paternalistic vision could accommodate workers' desire for a voice. But then, the company laid off. Dozens of workers, including several prominent union organizers. Company president William Murray, who was deeply opposed to unions, called it routine seasonal cutbacks. The union saw it as retaliation and a violation of the wage agreement's implied promise of job security. Tensions escalated rapidly. Union leaders argued that the company was punishing workers for organizing, violating their rights under federal labor law. Management insisted that business decisions about staffing levels were prerogatives that no union could dictate. On April 1, 1937, union members met again at the Palmyra firehouse. The mood was angry and determined. Union President Russell Bull Bayman, a physical giant of a man who had worked in the Hershey factory for years, called for action. The workers voted overwhelmingly to strike. The plan was simple. They would conduct a sit-down strike beginning the next morning. They would occupy the factory, shut down production, and force the company to negotiate in good faith. They believed, based on the GM victory in Flint, that a well-organized sit-down could succeed without violence, that the power of their collective action would bring management to the table. They had no idea what was coming. The next morning, April the 2nd at 11 a.m., Bull Bayman stood outside the Hershey chocolate factory on Chocolate Avenue. He waved a red handkerchief, the prearranged signal. Within minutes, the great machines that had hummed day and night for decades fell silent. Workers sat down at their posts. Others walked outside to form picket lines. Hundreds climbed onto the roofs of factory buildings, visible to everyone in town, silhouetted against the Pennsylvania sky. Above the factory, replacing the American flag that usually flew there, the strikers raised the banner of the CIO. That act, more than anything else, would come to symbolize the strike and would enrage those who saw it as desecration of everything Milton Hershey had built. The strike had begun, and from High Point Mansion on the ridge above the town, Milton Hershey watched as his workers rejected the paradise he had given them. The first few days of the strike felt almost festive. Strikers smiled for newspaper photographers and radio reporters who descended on Hershey to cover the unfolding drama. The sit-down was organized with impressive discipline. Workers rotated in shifts. A union kitchen provided meals. Surveillance teams monitored the factory to ensure no company property was damaged. Smoking was banned in sanitary areas. Entertainment was organized to keep spirits up. Workers sang songs, played cards, told stories. For the men inside, it felt more like a family squabble than an angry revolution, as one participant later recalled. These were men who had worked side by side for years, who lived on the same streets, whose children attended the same schools, who shared the same Pennsylvania Dutch heritage and Mennonite values. They weren't revolutionaries or radicals. They were asking for what seemed like basic fairness, recognition of their union, protection from arbitrary firings, a voice in decisions that affected their lives. But outside the factory, the mood was very different. The vast majority of Hershey's 3,000 factory workers wanted nothing to do with the strike. They saw it as betrayal of a man who had given them everything, an attack on the town they loved, an invitation for communist agitators to destroy their way of life. Many had grown up in Hershey, had gone to schools Milton built, had played in parks Milton created. The idea that their employer was their enemy seemed absurd and offensive. On April 3rd, the second day of the strike, a group called the Loyal Workers Club began organizing opposition. They held rallies denouncing the strikers as ungrateful communists. They circulated petitions demanding that the factory be reopened. They made it clear that they would not stand by while their town was destroyed by outside agitators. But the most intense opposition came from the dairy farmers. Hershey Chocolate Corporation purchased milk from dairy farms across 6 counties in central Pennsylvania. The factory processed massive quantities every single day. Estimates range from 60,000 to 70,000 gallons, perhaps as much as 800,000 pounds. This milk came from thousands of farming families for whom the Hershey contract was economic survival. Now, with the factory shut down, the milk sat spoiling. Farmers were dumping 800,000 pounds per day, enough to supply a city of 1 million people. Every gallon dumped represented lost income, money that farmers desperately needed to feed their families, pay their mortgages, survive from one season to the next. The farmers' anger was immediate and visceral. They hadn't asked to be involved in a labor dispute. They weren't taking sides on abstract questions about workers' rights or the union recognition. They simply needed the factory to open so they could sell their milk and avoid financial ruin. On Monday, April 5th, the 4th day of the strike, desperate dairy farmers met with union representatives. The meeting was tense. The farmers explained in plain language that they were losing everything. The union leaders, trying to show good faith and find common ground, agreed to a compromise. Strikers would operate the factory's creamery so the milk could be processed even while the strike continued. It seemed like a reasonable solution, a gesture of goodwill that might ease tensions and keep negotiations moving forward. The next day, Hershey's milkmen failed to pick up the milk. Whether this was a deliberate decision by company management or a logistical breakdown in the chaos of the strike remains unclear. But the result was predictable. The farmers' anger intensified dramatically. On the evening of April 6th, several thousand people marched through Palmyra in a massive rally. The crowd included loyal Hershey workers, dairy farmers from across the region, and members of various patriotic organizations. They carried signs denouncing the CIO as a communist organization bent on destroying American values. They proclaimed their loyalty to Milton Hershey and their determination to protect the town he had built. The speakers at the rally declared that the strikers had dishonored a heroic man who had given them everything. The CIO flag flying over the factory instead of the American flag was presented as proof of the strikers' un-American character, evidence that foreign ideologies had infected their perfect town. The crowd worked itself into a frenzy of righteous anger. People shouted, Fists were raised. The energy was electric and dangerous. By the time the rally ended, something terrible had been unleashed, a collective rage that would not be easily contained. That night, from the windows of High Point Mansion, Milton Hershey might have seen the torches and lights from the rally in Palmyra, might have heard the distant sound of thousands of angry voices carrying on the April wind. He was 80 years old, and the empire he had spent his life building was tearing itself apart. The next morning would bring violence that no one could have imagined. By 11 o'clock on the morning of April 7th, more than 3,000 people had gathered outside the Hershey chocolate factory. The crowd was a mixture of dairy farmers, loyal Hershey workers, and men from surrounding towns who had come for the fight. They came armed, baseball bats, billy clubs, hammers, lead pipes, ice picks, pitchforks, axe handles. The weapons had materialized from somewhere, some brought by individuals, others distributed through the crowd in ways that suggested organization and planning. Who organized the mob? Who distributed the weapons? These questions would be debated for years. Union leaders and many strikers believed, and oral histories later suggested, that company officials had orchestrated the attack, that weapons had been provided by management, that dairy farmers who depended on Hershey contracts had been essentially forced to participate on threat of losing their livelihoods. The company insisted that the violence was a spontaneous uprising by citizens outraged at the strike's disruption of their community, that the mob had formed organically out of genuine anger and frustration. The truth likely fell somewhere in between. The dairy farmers' rage was genuine. They were genuinely facing financial ruin. Many loyal workers genuinely believed they were defending their town against communist agitators. But someone had armed them. Someone had organized them. Someone had turned anger into violence. At some point that morning, accounts differ on exactly when and who initiated it. The crowd sent an ultimatum to the strikers inside the factory. Evacuate by 12 noon or suffer the consequences. Inside, union leaders scrambled. Bull Bayman and the other organizers met urgently with William Murray, the company president. They agreed to end the strike immediately. Murray promised to announce this to the crowd and call off the mob. But by then, it was too late. The crowd had its own momentum, its own terrible logic. Just before 1 p.m., even as union leaders were announcing the strike's end to workers inside, the mob outside began to surge toward the factory. What happened next lasted perhaps 30 minutes, but those 30 minutes would haunt Hershey, Pennsylvania for generations. The anti-union crowd outnumbered the strikers 4-1, 3,000 against perhaps 700. They carried weapons designed to hurt, to maim, to punish. As they approached the factory, the mob began to roar, a sound like an animal, like a storm, like something primal and unstoppable. Inside, strikers realized what was coming. Some tried to barricade doors. Others looked for exits. Still others stood frozen, unable to believe that their neighbors, their fellow workers, men they had known for years, were about to attack them with weapons. There was an exchange of taunts and insults through the factory windows. Strikers shouted that they had already agreed to end the strike. The mob shouted back accusations of betrayal and communism. Then someone threw the first stone, and the violence began. The mob smashed through doors and shattered windows. They poured into the factory like a flood, spreading through the buildings in search of strikers. When they found workers trying to flee, they attacked them. The assault was swift and brutal. Workers were struck with baseball bats, clubs, and hammers. Ice picks and lead pipes were used as weapons. The sounds of the violence echoed through the factory halls as men fell under the blows. Dozens suffered severe injuries, broken bones, head trauma, and deep lacerations. The strikers tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and outgunned in terms of weapons. Most tried to run, fleeing through the factory seeking any exit, any escape from the mob that pursued them with terrible determination. The three union leaders, Bull Bayman, John Loy, and Miles Sweeney, the CIO, organizer, were targeted specifically. The mob knew who they were, had identified them as ringleaders. Sweeney suffered severe head injuries from repeated blows. John Loy sustained facial injuries including broken teeth and a fractured jaw. Bull Bayman, despite his size and strength, was overwhelmed by multiple attackers. As strikers fled the factory, the mob pursued them into the streets. Rocks and stones were hurled at running men. Workers who stumbled or fell faced further violence. The assault left its mark on Chocolate Avenue, the sweet street that Milton Hershey had named decades earlier, when he imagined a town where workers would live in harmony and prosperity. In less than 30 minutes, it was over. The mob, having accomplished its goal of clearing the factory, began to disperse. Farmers returned to their dairy operations for the evening milking. Loyal workers went home to their families. The streets of Hershey slowly emptied as the adrenaline faded, and the magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. 25 strikers were hospitalized with serious injuries. Dozens more had been attacked, but managed to avoid hospitalization, nursing their wounds at home. The injuries ranged from cuts, bruises, and broken noses to fractured bones, severe concussions, and puncture wounds. Several men would carry permanent scars, physical reminders of the day their neighbors turned on them. The factory stood quiet, its windows broken, its floors bearing the evidence of violence. The machines that had hummed constantly for decades remained silent. And above the town, from the windows of High Point Mansion, Milton Hershey surveyed the wreckage of his perfect world. The violence that had erupted on his factory floor was violence that never should have happened in the paradise he had created. Workers who should have been grateful had struck against him. Farmers who depended on him had stormed his factory with weapons. Neighbors had beaten neighbors. Blood had been spilled on streets he had built, in buildings he had constructed, in a town that bore his name. Paradise had burned, and nothing would ever be the same. The political response was immediate. Pennsylvania Governor George Earle called the violence a disgrace and publicly blamed the Derry Township Sheriff for failing to prevent the mob from entering the factory. The National Labor Relations Board dispatched investigators to Hershey to determine what had happened and whether the company had violated federal labor law. But determining the truth proved difficult. The company insisted that the violence had been a spontaneous uprising by citizens outraged at the strike's disruption. Union leaders believed, and many strikers testified, that the attack had been orchestrated by company officials, with weapons distributed to loyalists and farmers forced to participate. Evidence suggested both were partially true. The dairy farmers' desperation was real. Many loyal workers genuinely believed they were defending their town, but the weapons came from somewhere. The mob was organized, and company officials at minimum did nothing to prevent the violence, despite having advance warning that it was coming. 2 weeks after the strike's violent end, the NLRB supervised a union election at the chocolate factory. Workers overwhelmingly chose the Independent Chocolate Workers, a small loyalist organization, over the CIO. It seemed like vindication of Milton Hershey's paternalistic vision, proof that his workers had rejected outside agitators. But the NLRB wasn't finished. Investigators continued examining the company's practices and the circumstances of the violence. In 1939, 2 years later, the NLRB issued its ruling. The Independent Chocolate Workers was an illegal company union created and controlled by management. The election had not been legitimate. The workers would have to vote again. This time, still wary of the CIO, workers selected Local 464 of the Bakery and Confectionery Workers International Union, affiliated with the more conservative American Federation of Labor. The new contract gave workers overtime pay, paid vacations, and, crucially, a formal grievance procedure that allowed them to challenge management decisions through arbitration rather than accepting whatever the company decided. The chocolate workers had finally won the right to a voice in their own working conditions, but the victory came at a terrible price. Milton Hershey was 80 years old in 1937, and the strike devastated him emotionally. The strike changed him, recalled William Murray years later. He was deeply hurt and felt all he had done for the town had been forgotten. Milton had built Hershey, Pennsylvania, from nothing. He had created thousands of jobs during the Depression. He had spent millions building monuments and providing his workers with wages and benefits that most industrial workers could only dream of. He had poured his fortune into creating a town that would endure for generations. And his workers had repaid him, as he saw it, with ingratitude and betrayal. They had struck against him. They had shut down his factory. They had rejected his benevolence. Of course, this interpretation ignored the workers' legitimate grievances about wages, hours, dangerous working conditions, and arbitrary management decisions. It ignored the paternalism that had made some workers feel like children who needed permission to live their own lives. And it certainly ignored the brutal violence that loyal workers and farmers had inflicted on their neighbors. But Milton Hershey couldn't see those complexities. To him, it felt like personal betrayal. He withdrew from the daily operations of both the chocolate company and the town. He spent more time at High Point, surrounded by memories of Catherine, of better days when the vision had seemed pure and the future unlimited. From the mansion's windows, he could still see his town spread out below. But now, when he looked down at the chocolate factory, did he see the blood that had stained its floors? Did he remember the sound of the mob, the screams of beaten men? Did he question whether his perfect town had been an illusion all along? Milton Hershey died on October 13, 1945, at the age of 88. His funeral was one of the largest ever seen in central Pennsylvania. Thousands lined the streets. Factory whistles blew in tribute. Businesses closed. Whatever complicated feelings people had about the strike and its aftermath, there was no question that Milton Hershey had been an extraordinary man who had created something unprecedented. The trust he had established in 1918 would continue to grow. Today it is worth more than $17 billion, making the Milton Hershey School one of the wealthiest educational institutions in America, still providing opportunities to children who need them most. Today, Hershey, Pennsylvania, continues to draw millions of visitors each year. They come to ride roller coasters in Hershey Park, to tour the chocolate attractions, to stay in the Grand Hotel Hershey, to walk streets named Chocolate and Cocoa Avenue. They experience the town that Milton Hershey built, the monuments he created during the Depression, the legacy of his vision. Most visitors never learn about April 7th, 1937. They don't know about the violence that erupted when workers demanded a voice in their own lives. They don't think about the injuries sustained on the factory floors, or the weapons used against fleeing workers on streets built by the man who wanted to create paradise. They see the success story, an uneducated boy who failed repeatedly before finding his calling, a self-made millionaire who gave his fortune away to educate orphan children, a visionary who built a town that provided good jobs and quality of life for thousands of families. All of this is true. Milton Hershey was an extraordinary man who accomplished extraordinary things. The Milton Hershey School has changed countless lives. The town of Hershey has prospered for more than a century. The philanthropy was real, and its positive effects continue today. But the 1937 strike and its brutal suppression reveals something equally true. That benevolence without democracy is still control. That generosity without respect is still paternalism. That paradise built by one man's vision alone is ultimately unstable because it denies the fundamental human need for agency and voice. High Point Mansion has served many purposes since Milton's death. For years, it housed the Hershey Country Club. Later, it became corporate offices for the Hershey Company and Hershey Trust. Today, portions have been restored to their original appearance and serve as an educational experience primarily for students of the Milton Hershey School. The house still stands on its limestone ridge, overlooking the town that chocolate built. From its windows, you can still see the grid of streets Milton laid out, the parks he designed, the monuments he built during the Depression. You can see the chocolate factory still operating, still producing the candy that made Hershey famous. But if you know the history, if you understand what happened on that April morning in 1937, you see something else too. You see the streets where a mob chased fleeing workers. You see the factory where neighbors beat neighbors with baseball bats and ice picks. You see the paternalistic control that bred resentment even as it provided prosperity. The mansion is elegant and well-preserved, a testament to one man's success and vision. But it also stands as a monument to the limitations of individual benevolence, no matter how sincere. Milton Hershey tried to build paradise. He came closer than most, but he learned in the end that paradise cannot be imposed from above. It must be built together by people who have a say in their own lives. 25 workers were hospitalized on April 7th, 1937. Their names have been largely forgotten, their stories buried beneath the more palatable narrative of chocolate and philanthropy. But their blood was real. Their injuries were real. The violence they suffered at the hands of their neighbors was real. And the lesson they taught, that even the most benevolent control is still control, that workers deserve not just good wages, but dignity and voice, that gratitude should never require silence in the face of injustice, remains as relevant today as it was the terrible morning when paradise burned. High Point stands witness to all of it, the triumphs and the tragedies, the vision and the violence, the sweetness and the blood. From its windows, the view remains as spectacular as ever. The rolling Pennsylvania hills, the chocolate factory, the town spreading out in neat grids below. But the ghosts remain too, whispers in the walls, memories in the floorboards. The ghost of Milton Hershey, who died too young. The ghost of Milton himself, an old man betrayed by the ingratitude of those he had tried to help. And the ghosts of April 7th, the workers who were attacked, the farmers who wielded clubs, the neighbors who turned on each other in an outbreak of violence that no one could have imagined in this town that smelled like chocolate and promised paradise. The mansion endures, the chocolate flows, the sweet smell still drifts across the Pennsylvania hills. And the dark story of April 7th, 1937 reminds us that even the grandest houses can contain the darkest secrets, and that the most benevolent visions can cast the longest shadows. This is the legacy of High Point. Not just a mansion on a hill, but a monument to the eternal tension between control and freedom, between benevolence and autonomy, between one man's vision of paradise and his workers' demand